Pressure mounts on Tinubu as momentum shifts toward Kanu. Abu of running out of options. This was not supposed to happen this way. For years, Abuja held the board. Every piece was in position. The courts were slow. The delays were managed. The international noise stayed distant enough to ignore. Nnamdi Kanu sat in detention and the machinery of power ground on without flinching. Tinubu's government had mastered one strategy above all others: control the timeline, control the narrative, let the pressure exhaust itself. But something has changed. And everyone watching can feel it. London has spoken, not through back channels, not through polite diplomatic whispers, publicly, directly, with the kind of language that carries weight across briefing rooms and international press wires. And when London speaks on a case that Abuja spent years trying to contain, the entire calculation shifts. What was buried is rising. What was managed is now unstoppable. What Tinubu once controlled with quiet confidence is now slipping into uncertainty. London called it a concern. Brussels raised questions about due process. Washington mentioned it in briefings. Diplomatic voices, rights organizations, global observers, all of them are now forcing open a case once buried behind bureaucracy. And the momentum, the kind of momentum that changes political outcomes, is no longer on the side of those holding the keys. Critics argue Tinubu understands the danger. His approach, delay, deflection, calculated silence, worked when attention was limited. But with momentum swinging outward, that strategy is collapsing. Each new voice adds weight. Each delay deepens suspicion. And time, once Tinubu's greatest weapon, is now his greatest enemy. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Time was always the plan. Stretch it out, wear it down, let the noise fade into silence. That was how power worked when you controlled the board, and for years, it worked perfectly. Nnamdi Kanu sat in detention, not forgotten but managed. His supporters shouted. His lawyers filed motions. International groups raised concerns. None of it truly landed. The machinery of delay ground on, steady and efficient. Court dates shifted, hearings postponed, documents delayed. Inside Abuja's corridors of power, confidence was absolute. This was a domestic matter, a contained situation. The noise would die down eventually. It always did. But somewhere between the courtrooms and the international calls for release, something began to shift. A letter from a foreign ministry here, a parliamentary question there, a rights organization adding Kanu's name to a list. Small things, easy to dismiss. Except they did not stop, they multiplied, and that is where the real problem began. London called it a concern. Brussels raised questions about due process. Washington mentioned it in a briefing. Not threats, just observations. Polite diplomatic language that carried weight beneath the surface. Inside the presidential villa, the mood changed. What had been a settled issue was now appearing in international briefings. Allies were asking uncomfortable questions. Journalists abroad were framing Nigeria's handling of the case as a test of democratic credibility. And worst of all, momentum was shifting. For the first time, the people managing Kanu's detention realized they were no longer just managing a domestic problem. They were managing a reputation crisis. And reputation crises do not respond well to delay. The strategy that had worked for years, silence, patience, control, was now creating the exact problem it was meant to avoid. Every postponement looked like evasion. Every delay deepened suspicion. And louder voices meant more pressure. More pressure meant political cost. And political cost meant something had to give. The fortress that had contained Kanu's case for years was still standing. But the cracks were visible now. And everyone watching knew what happened to fortresses once the cracks appeared. They did not repair themselves. They widened. President Tinubu had mastered the art of strategic silence. Throughout his career, he understood that sometimes the best move was no move at all. Let tension simmer. Let opponents overreach. Let time do the work. But silence only works when no one is listening. Now everyone was listening. The British Parliament was not just asking questions. Members were demanding answers. Human rights organizations were not just filing reports. They were naming names, placing Nigeria on lists alongside regimes no functioning democracy wanted to share space with. For Tinubu, this was no longer about Kanu. It was about Nigeria's image on the global stage, about investment confidence, about international partnerships, about whether the country could be trusted without becoming a liability. His advisors were split. Some argued for a political solution. Find a way to release Kanu quietly, frame it as mercy, move on. Others warned that releasing him would look like weakness, would embolden separatist movements, would be seen as surrendering to foreign pressure. Both sides had a point, and that was the problem. Publicly, the government maintained its position. The case was in the courts. Justice would take its course. Nigeria was a sovereign nation that did not bow to external pressure. But privately, the calculations were entirely different. Diplomats were reporting that Nigeria's international standing was taking hits. Investors were raising governance concerns. Allies were growing uncomfortable defending a position that was becoming harder to justify. International media began picking up the story. Not just African outlets, global networks. Kanu's case was being framed as a test. Could Nigeria balance security concerns with human rights obligations? The framing was damaging, and it was spreading. Inside the presidential villa, meetings grew tense. Options were discussed, discarded, reconsidered. Everyone had an opinion. No one had a solution. And through it all, one fact became impossible to ignore. The strategy of delay was no longer working. It was backfiring. Every silent day added fuel to the criticism. Every postponed hearing gave international observers more ammunition. Time, which had once been Tinubu's ally, was now working against him. The question was no longer whether something had to change. It was whether change would come on his terms or someone else's. And that is what made this so explosive. Senator Enyinnaya Abaribe stood before the press, and his words cut through the usual political noise. How long can a government claim to be democratic while holding a man without trial? How long can we ask the world to respect our sovereignty while we disrespect our own laws? The statement went viral within hours, not because it was particularly radical, but because of who said it and when. Abaribe was not a fringe voice. He was an establishment figure, someone whose words carried weight in the corridors of power, and he was saying publicly what many were saying privately. This was becoming a crisis. International organizations escalated their language. Amnesty International issued a fresh report. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Arbitrary Detention raised formal concerns. The European Parliament passed a resolution calling for due process. None of it was legally binding, but all of it mattered. Diplomatic relationships operate on trust and perception. When major allies begin questioning a government's commitment to rule of law, the problems extend far beyond the individual case. Trade negotiations stall. Security partnerships face scrutiny. Investment decisions get delayed. The cost of detention was no longer just political, it was becoming economic. Business leaders began speaking up. International investors wanted stability, predictability, respect for legal processes. The Kanu case was creating uncertainty, and uncertainty was expensive. Tinubu's entire economic agenda depended on foreign investment and international confidence. But that image was eroding with every headline about indefinite detention and ignored court orders. The British government issued a statement expressing concern about due process. Diplomatic language, yes, but the message was clear. This was being watched. American lawmakers raised the issue in hearings. Canadian officials mentioned it in bilateral meetings. The diplomatic pressure was not overwhelming, but it was consistent, steady, unavoidable. This was bigger than one man in one detention facility. This was about whether Nigeria could be held accountable. This was about who controls the narrative when African governments silence dissent and the world decides to look. And that is why this moment mattered. Inside government circles, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about whether to address the situation. It was about how. The question was not whether pressure was building. It was whether the government could afford to keep resisting it. Every day of delay added to the cost. Every week without resolution deepened the hole. The strategy of running out the clock was no longer viable, because the clock was running out on Tinubu. The turning point came quietly, as turning points often do. A senior government official speaking anonymously told a foreign journalist something that had not been said publicly before. "We know this has to end. The question is how to end it without looking weak." The quote spread quickly through international media, not because it revealed state secrets, but because it revealed something far more valuable: truth. The government was searching for an exit. That single admission changed everything. Behind closed doors, the calculation had shifted. The cost of keeping Kanu detained was now exceeding the cost of letting him go, but finding that exit was proving harder than anyone expected. Legal teams explored options. Could charges be dropped on procedural grounds? Could a medical release be arranged? Every option had complications. Every path forward created new problems. The difficulty was not legal. It was political. How do you reverse course without admitting you were wrong? How do you release someone you spent years calling a threat without undermining your own authority? Tinubu faced a dilemma that has trapped leaders throughout history: the inability to change position without appearing weak. And the longer he waited, the worse the options became. International pressure intensified. Rights organizations, sensing movement, increased their campaigns. Diplomatic channels carried more direct messages. Inside Nigeria, the pressure was building too. Protests grew larger. Legal challenges multiplied. Civil society groups coordinated campaigns. Even religious leaders began speaking out. The government tried new tactics. Spokespersons emphasized that the case was in the courts, not in the president's hands. Separation of powers was invoked. But everyone knew that argument was thin. If Tinubu wanted this case resolved, it would be resolved. Key allies began distancing themselves. Diplomatic partners grew colder. International media coverage turned harsher. The narrative was solidifying. Nigeria was holding a political prisoner, using the courts as cover, hoping the world would look away. But the world was not looking away. It was leaning in. For the first time in years, momentum shifted decisively. What had been a slow build became an avalanche. Organizations that had worked separately began coordinating. Governments that had stayed quiet began speaking up. Kanu's case was no longer just about Kanu. It had become a symbol of judicial independence, of presidential power, of whether a government could be forced to change course by external pressure. And symbols matter. Across this continent, symbols have started revolutions. Symbols have ended careers. Symbols have broken empires. For many Africans watching, this looked like something deeply familiar. A leader using the state's full legal machinery to silence one voice while framing it as rule of law. Critics across the continent recognized the pattern. It was not new, it was old. And the fact that it was now being exposed under international scrutiny felt, for many, like a small act of justice in a world where African dissidents have historically been disappeared without consequence. Then came the announcement that changed the calculation completely. The European Union announced a review of its partnership agreements with Nigeria, specifically citing concerns about rule of law and due process. It was not officially framed as a threat, but the implications were unmistakable. Trade preferences, security cooperation, development funding, all of it would be examined through the lens of governance and human rights. And Kanu's case would be Exhibit A. The announcement hit Abuja like a thunderclap. This was no longer diplomatic noise. These were concrete consequences. Economic advisors sounded alarms. Losing EU trade preferences would cost billions. Jeopardizing security partnerships would undermine counter-terrorism efforts. Damaging international credibility would make every other negotiation harder. The political cost had become real, measurable, unavoidable. Tinubu called emergency meetings. Ministers, security chiefs, legal advisors, political strategists. Everyone who had an opinion on the Kanu case was in the room. The discussion was heated. Some argued for standing firm. Giving in to foreign pressure, they warned, would set a dangerous precedent. Others insisted the cost of resistance was now too high. Nigeria could not afford international isolation over one detention case. But beneath all the arguments, everyone in that room knew the truth. The situation was untenable. The strategy of delay had collapsed completely. Tinubu listened, his face unreadable. But those who knew him well noticed something different. The confidence was gone. The certainty had evaporated. For the first time, he looked cornered, not by opposition, not by courts, but by a combination of forces that had aligned in ways he never anticipated. Domestic pressure meeting international consequences, meeting economic reality. This is what happens when Africa's own contradictions are exposed on a global stage. When the tools of suppression that once worked quietly begin to cost more than they produce. Outside the presidential villa, speculation reached fever pitch. Media coverage intensified. Every government statement was analyzed. Every procedural move was scrutinized. Commentators debated not whether Kanu would eventually be released, but when and how. The opposition sensed the shift. Criticism became sharper. Former allies began repositioning. Political calculations were already changing as people prepared for whatever came next. And internationally, the drumbeat continued. More statements, more resolutions, more diplomatic pressure. The message was unified and unmistakable. This has to end. Inside government circles, contingency plans were drafted. Legal frameworks were explored. Political strategies were debated. But every option required one thing that had become increasingly difficult: decisive action. And decisive action meant accepting that the original strategy had failed. For a leader who built his reputation on control and calculation, that admission was almost as painful as the decision itself. The silence from the presidential villa became deafening. When governments go quiet under pressure, political observers know what it means. Decisions are being made, the kind that cannot be walked back once announced. Legal teams worked through options. One path involved releasing Kanu on health grounds, a face-saving mechanism used by governments throughout history. Another involved dropping charges based on procedural violations. A third suggested a political solution disguised as a legal one. Each option carried a cost. Each would invite criticism. But continuing the current path was no longer viable. The international pressure had become too intense, the economic consequences too real, the political damage too severe. Even Tinubu's strongest supporters acknowledged the reality in private. This situation had to end. The only question was how to end it in a way that preserved some appearance of control. Security advisors warned about precedent. Release Kanu, they argued, and separatist movements across Nigeria would be emboldened. It would look like foreign pressure could dictate government decisions. Political advisors countered with equal urgency. Keep Kanu detained and watch Nigeria's international standing collapse further. Watch investments disappear. Watch partnerships erode. Watch the country become a cautionary tale rather than a model. Both sides were right, and that was precisely the problem. In moments like this, across Africa and across history, this is the trap that captures leaders who use detention as political strategy. It works until it does not. It holds until the pressure from outside meets the pressure from inside, and the walls become a liability rather than a fortress. Many Africans watching understood this, because this continent has seen it before. Leaders who detained critics too long. Leaders who let international image collapse while managing domestic optics. Leaders who mistook silence for stability and control for consent. The pattern is not new, but the consequences are always the same. Reports began circulating, unofficial, unconfirmed, but persistent, that a decision had been made, that legal mechanisms were being prepared, that an announcement was coming. The government neither confirmed nor denied. The silence continued. International observers watched carefully. Rights organizations prepared statements. Media outlets positioned reporters. Everyone sensed that something was about to shift. Inside Kanu's detention facility, subtle changes were noticed by those close to the situation. His supporters sensed the movement. Protests grew larger. Social media exploded with speculation. The energy had changed. The mood had changed. What had felt immovable was now visibly moving. Then came the announcement, carefully worded, dense with legal language. References to procedural concerns. Reviews of continued detention. Technical terminology designed to obscure rather than clarify. But buried in that language was something that had not existed before. Acknowledgement that the current situation required re-examination. Not a release, not an exoneration, a review. But everyone understood what it meant. After years of absolute certainty, the government had shifted. The walls had not fallen yet, but they had moved, and walls that move eventually fall. International observers cautiously welcomed the development while demanding concrete action. Rights organizations called it insufficient, but acknowledged the momentum. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity. Domestically, the response was more complicated. Kanu's supporters saw the review as a first step. Opposition figures claimed vindication. Government officials who had previously defended the detention loudly now said nothing. The silence of those defenders was the loudest signal of all. Inside the presidential villa, the mood was grim. This was not victory, it was retreat dressed in procedural language. Tinubu had been forced into a position he never wanted, responding to external pressure, moving because staying still had become impossible. For a leader who prided himself on controlling narratives and dictating terms, this represented something fundamental, a loss of initiative, a loss of the story. And across the continent, more people than just Kanu's supporters were watching. Because this was never only about Nnamdi Kanu. This was about power, about who holds it and who challenges it, about whether African governments can indefinitely silence voices that inconvenience them, about whether the international community's pressure means anything, or whether it simply evaporates when political will is missing, about whether sovereignty is used as a shield to protect citizens or as a wall to hide abuses from scrutiny. For many observers across West Africa, across the diaspora, across every corner of this continent where people have watched their own governments use detention as a political tool, this moment carried meaning beyond one man and one cell in one capital city. Africa was watching, and Africa was drawing conclusions, not just about Tinubu, but about what it takes to move entrenched power, about where pressure comes from when domestic opposition is suppressed, about the cost of silence and the cost of speaking, about the difference between sovereignty genuinely exercised in service of a people and sovereignty invoked to protect a political class from accountability. The walls around Kanu were cracking. Everyone could see it. The question now was not whether they would fall. The question was what would come after, what precedent would be set, what message would be sent to every other political prisoner on this continent, to every government still confident that detention without accountability was a sustainable strategy. Because this case, in its long and painful unfolding, had revealed something important. Something that African political commentary channels and continental observers and diaspora voices had been saying for years. External pressure, when it aligns with internal truth, can break what looked unbreakable. But external pressure alone is not the answer. It cannot be. Africa cannot outsource its justice to London or Brussels or Washington. The deeper lesson here is not that foreign governments save the day. The deeper lesson is that the combination of international attention and domestic resistance and relentless civil society pressure created a cost that exceeded political will. That combination is what changed the calculation. And if that combination can be built again, sustained, organized, focused, it can change other calculations too. In other capitals, around other detention cases, against other governments that believe silence and delay will protect them from accountability. History shows one thing clearly. When pressure becomes unavoidable, when reputations, alliances, and economic realities are all placed at risk simultaneously, entrenched power begins to move. Slowly, reluctantly, through procedural language and carefully managed announcements. But it moves. Kanu's case is entering that phase. The fortress has cracked. The momentum has shifted. What Tinubu once managed with confidence is now beyond his full control. And what comes next? The timing, the framing, the conditions will say everything about who is actually holding the power in this confrontation. The walls are still standing, but they are no longer solid. And across this continent, more people are beginning to understand exactly what that means. Not just for one man in one detention center, but for every voice that power has tried to bury, for every leader who believed that silence was permanent, for every government that confused controlling the present with controlling the future. Africa is watching, Africa is remembering. And Africa, slowly but unmistakably, is learning that when enough pressure comes from enough directions at once, even the most entrenched positions cannot hold forever. The question is no longer whether change is coming. The question is what we do with it when it arrives.